Thank you, Lorraine. So it was actually it was interesting. Lorraine wrote an email into the state treasurer's general email saying, "Hey, I hope you're not doing anything with ESG," something like that. And anyway, I thought, well, I'd received 2 or 3 emails like that, and she had left her contact information. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to reach out to her and just talk to her about it. And so I did. I called her on the phone and I said, "So how do you know about ESG?" Right? And anyway, we ended up having a really great conversation, and it's developed into a nice relationship. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to be able to talk about this issue that I was aware of in the investment world, because that's where I spent most of my career, was institutional investment management. For the last 7 or 8 years, I've been doing more investment banking. So the role of the treasurer is really primarily investment management and investment banking, and there are some financial literacy, educational components. I sit on 20 boards, something like that. Most of them don't meet regularly, thank heavens, like the Martha Hughes Cannon Statue Committee. I've never been to a meeting of that one, but so hopefully when if you've been up to the Capitol on the 3rd level, you see the Martha Hughes Cannon statue right outside the Supreme Court building. That's going to be, by the way, she's on the bill. The reason she's on the bill is she's going to be one of 2 people representing the state of Utah in the Capitol, the Rotunda back in Washington, D.C. So anyway, so I sit on a lot of boards. Most of them are related somehow financially to something we're doing in the state of Utah. Investment boards like Utah Retirement Systems, SITFO, which is the trust lands, the money that has come off the trust lands, and that helps schools and school children. There's community, what are they called? Community councils, at schools, and they decide how that money is spent. That portfolio is about $3 billion. Utah Retirement Systems is around $50 billion. In the Treasurer's office, we have another $30 billion. Most of that is short-term investments, so it's like a money market fund that provides overnight liquidity or daily liquidity, mostly for municipal entities around the state, including universities and others. So over 750 different municipal entities. That portfolio is 29 of the 30 billion that we oversee in the Treasurer's office. So the most challenging part of the job is the investment management. And of all 50 treasurers in the United States, there's one with institutional investment management experience, and you're looking at him. So that gives me a unique insight into what's happening today in the capital markets, which is why I'm here. As Lorraine said, I thought this was going to be the least political office. And when I learned about ESG, it's turning into the most political office, possibly in the state, or maybe the highest profile political office in the state, just because of the national and global implications of ESG. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. If you think about traditional investment management, traditional values-based investment management strategies, these have been around for centuries. So religious organizations are often the ones that are implementing these kinds of portfolios. So the traditional term is socially responsible investing. So as a religious organization, I may decide that I don't want to invest in certain sectors of the marketplace, and so I avoid them. And so ESG is an outgrowth of that. What makes it different is that as a socially responsible investor, I respect other investors to have a different view from my own, and I respect the marketplace where other investors are operating. So for example, I may avoid tobacco, alcohol, firearms, gambling. These are traditional socially responsible screens. ESG is aggressive. It takes it engages with companies, it engages with the marketplace to drive a political agenda. So for example, the E part, so environmental, that's, the big driver is climate risk and net zero climate initiatives. So in the United States, there's even Europe really primarily, but now in the United States, a big push to get companies to commit to net zero initiatives. But what this looks like from an investment perspective, and why I say ESG is more aggressive, if I'm an investor in ExxonMobil, my investment thesis likely revolves around the idea that oil and gas are important components in our economy. I want exposure to those, and so I'm going to invest in a company like ExxonMobil that's their business, is oil and gas extraction, exploration, things of that nature. What I'm not expecting is for a company like BlackRock to go into ExxonMobil, engage with management, and tell management that they need to cut oil production by 20%. That impacts my investment thesis and my investment, and it affects all other investors in the marketplace. It is fundamentally much more aggressive than a traditional socially responsible investor that doesn't engage with management to change companies or to change the marketplace. So this is where ESG changes how we operate in the United States. So that's on the economic side. But on the political side, I call ESG really an investment scoring system to measure compliance to a political agenda. So if you have a high ESG score, it means you're doing what you're supposed to do under the ESG criteria, whoever is deciding what those criteria are. So Sri Lanka, perfect example. Sri Lanka had the highest ESG score in the world. It was doing great from an ESG perspective, but how did that help them this last summer when society threw out the government, right? If that's a high ESG score, I don't really want a high ESG score because civil unrest is not my idea of fun, right? What happened in Sri Lanka was nitrogen fertilizer was outlawed. Basically, the president of Sri Lanka said, we are no longer going to use or allow nitrogen fertilizer to be used in our country, and we're going to have to go to organic fertilizer. Well, the production of food actually fell dramatically and was leading to basically a food crisis, a famine in Sri Lanka, where the price of food skyrocketed at the same time that oil and gas prices were going up. And the people said, we are going to die. We are getting rid of this president. He's out of here. So the nitrogen fertilizer story is tied back into climate risk and climate agenda. So in the name of saving the planet, we are going to lower food production using organic fertilizer. That's a really great plan. What's that? Yeah, yes. Yes. So another area that's interesting, people get confused about this. Business has been involved in politics for a very long time. Businesses have donated to candidates. They hire lobbyists, right? This is the traditional engagement in the political process that businesses have done. I worked at an insurance company, and we had lobbyists in California. That's where the insurance company was. Lobbyists in California because to protect the interests of the insurance company in the state with the state lawmakers. That's a very legitimate thing for business to be involved in. What's changed is that instead of keeping our political issues in our democratically defined political institutions, we've moved them now into the business world. And so no longer are we just depending on political institutions to pass laws or to protect us from bad policy. Those those political agendas are now being moved into the business world, where you can drive a political outcome without the same accountability that we have in those political institutions. So ESG, it is political at its most fundamental level because you're looking at very subjective criteria, agendas that, in the case of environmental, the Green New Deal didn't make it through Congress. But now it's in the business world. So you don't have to worry about, the political wrangling in that area. You can just push it through corporate America, and you can shame people who don't go along with the agenda, right? Ronald Reagan said in 1980, the biggest threat to freedom was big government. Today's the biggest threat to freedom is government and big business working together to drive a political agenda. In fact, one of my favorite quotes, if I can pull it up here. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay, when we harness the power of both the public and private sectors, we can achieve truly incredible things. This is what we must do to get to net zero. Okay, we need to harness the power of both the public and private sectors. Candace Periucci, welcome. No, you're fine. The outstanding Candace Periucci representative. Is this your area? My area. Well, see, awesome. Thank you for coming. It's awesome, fantastic. So this was Larry Fink this last year in his letter to CEOs across America. Okay, I'll read it again. When we harness the power of both the public and private sectors, we can achieve truly incredible things. This is what we must do to get to net zero. Okay, so we have the largest investment manager in the world, $8.5 trillion that Larry Fink oversees at BlackRock. It's not their money, and they admit that. Now, they'll tell you that they're not driving a political agenda, but they have a group of 70 analysts in a stewardship group that's at BlackRock. So if you have a portfolio at BlackRock, it's likely not going to be an ESG portfolio. But they have a separate stewardship group that engages with corporate America and tells them how they need to behave. The public or the private sector going in to the private sector to drive a political agenda that didn't make it through our public democratic institutions, political institutions. So ESG undermines the Constitution of the United States and free market capitalism. Free market capitalism does not exist where you have the same view, the same agenda that people have latched onto. Let's call it the climate crisis, right? If I believe that we're all going to die unless we do something about the climate, then we all have the same view. We implement the same agenda for something in the future that we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. That destroys markets. You have companies, financial companies like banks, asset managers, investment managers, asset owners like CalPERS, CalSTRS, these large pools of capital. When they sign on to an agenda like a net zero climate agenda, what they're basically committing to do is to not provide capital to the oil and gas, traditional energy sector. That is fundamentally undermining free market capitalism, because when you have the 6 largest banks in the United States all signing on to that agenda, then a JP Morgan and a Bank of America and a Citigroup and a Goldman Sachs and a Morgan Stanley and I'm forgetting one, Wells Fargo, if none of them are willing to lend capital to a massive project, it may not get the capital that it needs. If you have free market capitalism, if JP Morgan decides that, well, Bank of America might step in where JP Morgan didn't. That's free market capitalism. That's the allocation of capital where it is needed. Now, let me tell you something magical about the free market system. It's driven by you and me, right? It's driven by the demand side. So we are the ones that are driving it through our economic choices, our free market choices. We're deciding what cars we want to buy. We're not being told that we have to buy an EV in California and then you can't charge it, right? But when an agenda comes from the top down, that's socialism. Now, underlying ESG is something called stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is completely opposite of what we have in the United States. Because you are talking about stakeholders, you have to satisfy all the demands of your stakeholders if you're a business owner. And if you look at who the stakeholders are, it's everybody. So you're accountable to everybody, which means you're basically accountable to no one, which means you will listen to those who have the largest and most violent voices. And guess who that is? Okay? So stakeholder capitalism is effectively socialism. You might even think of it as communism. Because you are substituting a pluralistic institution for centralized control by those who have the loudest voices. ESG is essentially that substitution of our pluralistic institutions for centralized control. Think about our market base of ideas, the market of ideas, right? The public square. The public square operates if you have free speech and you allow people to express their opinions no matter how outrageous they are. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, I was at the Jefferson Memorial. Oh, it's on my other phone. There is a quote. Thomas Jefferson said, "We should not be afraid of," he didn't say misinformation, but that was the idea, as long as we are free to pursue the truth. Which is essentially saying, look, misinformation and disinformation are not a threat to us if we are allowed to pursue truth and to find truth. If we shut down alternative voices, we lose the marketplace of ideas. And there is also a marketplace, a financial marketplace. And if you don't allow people to supply capital where it needs to go, you're destroying that marketplace, the allocation of capital. In 2008, 2009, the great financial crisis was an early example of ESG. In the name of social justice, banks were strong-armed to provide capital to people who didn't deserve loans because home ownership was an American right. And what happened? You saw a ton of capital moving in where it normally would not have gone because it was too risky to do that. And as a result, we almost collapsed the entire market. So you see the misallocation of capital, in that case, too much capital going somewhere. Today, the misallocation is too little capital going into the oil and gas sectors. So we have chronically underinvested in oil and gas in this country. Since 2015, there was about $50 billion raised in private funds globally for oil and gas projects. Now, those are going to come from large pension systems, European, US pension systems, where they're allocating capital to private projects in the oil and gas space. In 2020, it was around 20 billion, something like that. I mean, it had fallen dramatically. But then in 2021, it went to 5 billion. That doesn't happen without a push, some external non-market push. And that's what happened with ESG, because 2021 was a critical year. You had an administration change. That administration was pro-ESG, pro this agenda. And so I believe, and I'm speculating here, but I believe that it gave the marketplace, those who wanted to push this agenda, felt like they had a free get-out-of-jail card. Because as a fiduciary, I'm a fiduciary overseeing billions of dollars here in this state. My fiduciary obligation is to the beneficiaries in this state. I can't add another agenda on top of trying to get the best return for a given level of risk. That is my I owe it to the state of Utah to do my best to get the best return for a given level of risk. If I add another agenda on that, I have a dual mandate, that's illegal. It's against the fiduciary standards in this country. But as soon as the administration came in and changed, there was almost a belief that that wouldn't matter, right? That I could get away with, if I wanted to, I could take on another agenda. So then you saw the banks sign on to net zero climate pledges in 2021, when John Kerry went around and signed up big banks to get them to sign on to this agenda. And that's when you saw ESG go from socially responsible investing to an aggressive anti-free market, really anti-American strategy. This is primarily coming from Europe. Our largest banks have global operations, and the European Union is pushing this agenda here. It's not coming from the United States, although there are people in the United States, large pension systems in the United States, that believe in this agenda and have adopted it. But the primary drivers are the UN and, the UN, the European Union, World Economic Forum, stuff that sounds like, crazy conspiracy theory stuff, but it's all out there. Larry Fink is on the board of the World Economic Forum. This is fundamentally a globalist agenda that is anti-American at its core, because we believe we got away from Europe once to get away from the monarchical system where it was the elites, the church, the monarchy going into the back room and figuring out what was best for all of us and implementing that through society. We came to this country and said, we want to distribute power widely. We are going to create three branches of government with checks and balances. We're going to have other institutions in our society, churches and others that have their own power, and we're going to broadly distribute power because we don't want it consolidating into the hands of a few people. Well, guess what's happened in the financial markets? Power has consolidated into the hands of few people. Those entities have been captured by global elite organizations, and we see the implementation of ESG to drive one political agenda. And suddenly our very freedoms are at risk in a very serious way. And so that's why I'm talking to you guys. And it's appropriate. It's about Halloween time. So, yes. It will. Well, so I actually had one of the senators in the state send me a text a couple days ago. The SBA, through one of our local banks, it's not the local bank doing this, but the SBA is telling a local business that's trying to get a loan that they need to implement solar and other kind of renewable energy in their project if they want to get a good loan. So this is, it's not going to stop there. In China, so I served as a missionary in Hong Kong. And then my first job out of school was in Hong Kong as well. The Chinese love ESG. They don't implement it on themselves. They implement it on their people through social credit scores. You basically, if you want to have a social credit score where you're controlling people's individual behavior, you need a digital ID and a digital currency. And then you can drive behavior remarkably well because you can cut off people's money, right? And you can tell them, well, you need to take the bus. You're not taking your car because you had the wrong attitude about whatever, right? I mean, it's pretty scary. That's why I think the next step in ESG is the digitization of everything, which is a huge concern to me. Because once all that information about us is out there and you have the ability to control people through a digital monetary system and you've identified who they are and what actions they're doing, then you can have a lot of control over people. So, yes.
All right, Marlo, you can't leave us on that Halloween note. These are great people. Marlo is one of the foremost experts in the country on this. He's going around speaking to so many different treasurers in other states. And we started off with the letter you sent. The legislature's on board. So tell us how we're going to fight back.
Yes.
What are we doing to fix this? Because I know we've got at least a dozen bills, and I just think that's helpful for everyone to know, like, we're not taking it.
Oh yeah, no. In fact, the legislature has been very supportive of this. We and just to give you some background, I had been talking for months about the state of Utah having the best credit in the world. We have never been downgraded by a credit rating agency. We have always been rated AAA ever since any of the credit rating agencies started rating our debt. And as a result, we are a highly sought after name in an investor's portfolio because we're very conservative run state and we have tremendous financials and we're just a great story. And I told people that. I said, but it may not matter if we have a separate ESG rating, because the market can then point to that separate rating and say, well, yeah, Utah has the best credit in the world, but it doesn't matter because look at what they're doing, why their ESG score is low. Perfect example. Under S, so when S&P Global came out and started rating states, state of Utah, okay, it wasn't a particularly negative report, but I was very much opposed to it because the mechanism of ESG is really coercive capitalism. You're bringing an outside entity in that rates the state on political issues. And those political issues then can drive your ability to get capital in the marketplace. It threatens the sovereignty of the state of Utah. And so I spoke with all of the leaders here in the state. The president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, are all 6 on the congressional delegation, so both senators and 4 congressmen, the governor, lieutenant governor, auditor, attorney general. All of them signed a letter responding to S&P Global that said, we do not want an ESG rating on the state of Utah and to withdraw it. That, I think, was an unprecedented letter in the history of the state. Let me finish. I'll get to you. Hold on. Let me just hold your thought. So S&P, they basically said Utah is in a drought. And I said, look, if it's a financially material issue, put it in the credit rating where it's always been. Whatever the ESG metric is, if it is financially material to our ability to pay an investor back, then it belongs in the credit rating. There's no reason to create a separate ESG rating. Under S, one of the factors, they didn't provide a score on it, but one of the factors is adverse publicity resulting in reputational risk. Now, what state has more reputational risk than the state of Utah? For heaven's sakes, a bunch of former polygamists started this place, right? That was not popular. Okay. We've had reputational risk ever since, right? August 26th, I think it was, in Provo, Smith Fieldhouse, women's volleyball game, BYU. What happened? An opposing team member accused somebody a spectator of hurling racial slurs at that person. Well, Utah does have a racist reputation, the NAACP said. And there were a lot of negative articles published. Now let's assume that that is true, that story was true. Let's just assume that it was true, okay? One person had the ability to create adverse publicity resulting in reputational risk for the state of Utah and therefore potentially harm all of us by causing our borrowing rate to go up in the marketplace. Does it have anything to do with our ability to pay back an investor? No. That's why this is so problematic and why I'm fighting this, because it represents the politicization of everything.
I'm just going to say, it hit home to me because I saw the hearing with the CEO of Chase Bank, which I deal with, being told by senators that you're going to tell your, people that...
Your clients, right?
Your clients that won't go Green New Deal or whatever it is, that they no longer can have an account with you. And
Yeah.
they said, blank, no, that would bring us down to whatever. And
Yes.
boy, did she get on him yesterday.
Now that was a very important event, because when I stood up against this, I said, we as states are going to have to start pushing back. It's going to have to be the states that do this, because the private sector is going to be canceled. They are under economic extortion in a lot of cases. Where I know of cases where blue state pension plans have gone into investment managers and said, if you want to keep managing money for us, you have to implement ESG across all of your portfolios. There's economic extortion happening in the marketplace. And if you don't have ESG somewhere on your website, then you may suffer from a business perspective. That was the first time that the private sector has stood up to the communists in Congress and said, no, we're not going to do that. That was a very important tipping point, I hope. And I hope it continues. JP Morgan was in our office this week, and I spoke specifically about that. And I said, I noticed that, and I applaud the bank for doing that. I hope the word gets back to Jamie Dimon that we have got to have more of that, and are fully supportive of him pushing back against ESG. That's what we need in the marketplace, and we need more people to stand up and do that. So, did you have a...
I was just going to reference back when you talked about publicity, even the bills we run, they tell us, so the sports bill that we did, protecting women's sports, we were told this is going to create bad publicity of the state. It's another way to drive the political discourse, what we can discuss. So anyways, I just want to bring that up as an example.
No, that's a great example. And like sports, right? All-star games, right? You're going to jeopardize the All-Star game if you pass the wrong policy.
Yeah. Because these companies, these private entities are beholden to this, but we're going to do what we're going to do, right? And that's our job as legislators, and I think our culture in Utah are like, we're going to do the right thing here. But it's important that if enough states push back, and if the money stops flowing to the wrong people, then you can reroute the system.
Yes. Yeah, because what's happened until this year, ESG has been sort of a free option for investment managers and those people who are pushing this agenda. There hasn't been a price to pay for it, right? But now with states and other people standing up, suddenly there is a price to pay. Now we're giving businesses a reason not to adopt ESG, and there's another side who is being recognized that, they have a legitimate concern with ESG, therefore, we can't implement this, or we can't do this, right? Yeah, go.
I just wanted to say, with your story about the volleyball game, another huge danger is if that's allowed to continue, then that will turn the public, many people in the public, against one individual, where they will get canceled or have violent threats or
Absolutely,
like we've seen the last couple of years.
No, that's exactly right. This whole idea of if you have the wrong thoughts, or you take the wrong action, and you're going to be canceled or worse, is incredibly dangerous to society and to a free society, because you're ultimately driving to one narrative. This is what the Nazis did. Right now I'm reading a book called Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. And the SS and the SA went around. This was in the early 30s when Hitler was trying to come to power, and they would silence their opposition. They would go pull down their political signs and threaten them and beat them up. And I mean, the kind of intimidation that we're seeing here in the United States. It's a little bit different here. We're seeing people being deplatformed primarily, and kicked off of the public square. But the effect is basically the same. Where if you don't have the right ideas or the correct ideas, you're threatened.
You were saying in Sri Lanka that they're attacking the farming community and causing the food thing. Well, we work with a lot of farmers here, like in this land, to a lot of them in the States. I work for the state. And I know that there is a gentleman that set up a banking thing because he said the farmers, and I know the farmers are struggling right now. We have a lot of farmers that are shutting down and they just aren't doing well. And he said that they're being told by the government right now that they can't get loans unless they use that fertilizer. Exact fertilizer that you're talking about in Sri Lanka, and they're trying to do it here. They're trying to kill us through that way. So they're not hitting us personally, but they're hitting our farmers, which is going to hit our agriculture and everything. And so I know that there is one gentleman that stepped up, and he is taking on the government by giving loans to him personally. And so in a roundabout way, he's reversing exactly what the government's doing because he's taking the money still from the government and giving it back to the farmers, trying to help them, but the loans are coming to him personally.
Yeah.
But they're hitting us. So how is that going to get stopped? And, sorry, to further that question, if the dollar collapses, which, I mean, I think we all kind of wonder at some point, could it, would it? Then will they force us into ESG even though we're pushing back right now? Because then they've got a hold on us, putting us into a digital currency at that point, because they can do anything they want if it does. So,
Yeah.
it was such a...
I wish I were God. And then I could answer your question. I have no idea. It's scary, right? I'm very glad to hear, though, that people are providing solutions like that. I think those are the kinds of solutions that we need to be thinking about as society, because you think about the two foundational industries for human survival, power and agriculture. You can't really thrive without those two industries. So we're talking about the foundation of society. I know that there are people who are working on different ways of addressing this. Getting back to the legislative solutions that we're talking about here in the state, there's actually, I think, almost 40 bill files open. Yeah. So we're trying to narrow it down and basically looking at the fiduciary standard. The fiduciary standard in the United States is a bulwark against this because it requires anybody who is overseeing investments of other people, or like in my case, another thing that I do is access the capital markets to borrow money. I have to get the best execution and price, to get the lowest borrowing costs that I can for the state. Having a fiduciary standard holds me to a very simple responsibility, and that is to do what's in the best interest of the beneficiaries, the taxpayers, whoever they are. And I can only look at risk and return, right? Portfolio context. I can't drive a political agenda. So the fiduciary standard is very important in this country. We have got to do everything we can to protect it and to strengthen it. So I'm very supportive of efforts in that area, and trying to figure out how do we hit those who are pushing this agenda without harming ourselves. That's a tricky one, because what we've seen, like with Texas and West Virginia, some of these states that have created lists to boycott specific companies, that can have negative implications for the states. So, for example, I went to market with a Utah bond in May, and our top 6 bidders banks that bid on the bonds to market them to investors would all have been on that list, a list of banks to avoid. And the result would have been higher interest that we would have paid as a state when we're borrowing. So it can boomerang on you if you're not careful, right? So we want to do it's kind of smart legislation. And there are ways that we can do things, but we're looking at all of those different options and how do we protect ourselves and maintain our freedoms without creating unintended consequences.
How many other states are on board right now?
So they're around 23 states.
The red states, the Republican states were banding together.
Yeah.
And so, I know you can't predict the future, but do you have an idea of what might happen if,
Yeah. If we take back the House.
well, that too, about them cheat their way through. But what if you don't get everybody else on board? Are we going to end up dueling?
We have a pretty strong defense industry here. Just kidding. Hopefully we defend ourselves, right? We got to defend ourselves, but no.
But if the others say, no, we're totally on board with this, are we able to operate independently?
Well, I think that's the challenge because you've seen this. The federal government was never meant to be weaponized against the citizenry, right? So with the whole of government approach of this administration, we're seeing the weaponization of the regulatory state against businesses and individuals, and so the SEC is one of the most politicized regulatory bodies out there. They oversee the investment industry and some of the banking industry, and so part of the problem is you have pressure coming from the regulatory state into the private sector. And then you have these international or global bodies putting pressure on the private sector, including the European Union. And so one of the key cases in this country this last year was West Virginia versus EPA, which basically said a regulatory body cannot pass law. That's Congress's job. I mean, it's right there, item 1 of the Constitution. I mean, it's right at the top, right? But we have created a monster. And that monster in 2021 was turned on and weaponized against us. And now we're seeing what a monster we've created. So it's very troubling, but I think one of the things that we have to do is, as states, we need to take back the power that is given to us in the Constitution. That's a way to protect ourselves because we as the states created the federal government, not the other way around, right? And so we are seeing a push by states to say, what do we need to do to put this monster in its place and protect ourselves? Yes, that's a huge part.
I was just gonna say, I've talked to, I'm sorry to interrupt. Part of that's not taking federal funding. Every time you take a grant and aid or block grant, there's gonna be strings attached to it. So some of us working in the education space have said, how much money do we get from the federal government for education that we could just completely shift gears?
Yes.
So that's, but I think too, if enough states, like 24 states, right, are bought into this. I know Vivek Ramaswamy. Yeah, he had said he's working on starting. I mean, it would take years to build up the big empire that we're discussing here. But alternative sources for loans, like this gentleman you mentioned, where people are not going to be holding to it. But.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, we're seeing the danger of taking federal money, right? Because suddenly now, it's like the SBA. Like if you want a loan, you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z, right? So that's the problem with taking money from the federal government. We lose our independence.
How much support or opposition do you get from the Utah legislature when the government talks?
None. I have incredible support from almost all of them. The only opposition that I've heard from or heard of is the minority side claiming that I'm fighting climate change. And the reality is I don't really talk about climate. And why? Because I'm not a policy officer. I don't go into the legislature and create bills. I'm overseeing the money. I don't want to deal with that. That's why I vote for Candace. I want her to deal with it, right? So that's a really important distinction that the Democrats really should be behind. If you are for ESG, then you are fundamentally against the United States of America because you are against the Constitution and our free market capitalist system. That's why I say this is an issue that should be bipartisan. If you care about America, you will be against ESG, and therefore this is not a red and blue issue. This should be an American issue. I believe very firmly that this is a Revolutionary War moment that we are sitting in, that we as Americans put aside our differences, we come together and we save our country, we save our freedoms, and then we can go back to fighting with each other. Kind of like what Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton, right? All of them did, right? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, with these ESG scores, like, I kind of watch China, what's going on in China. I saw a video that they run to keep their score green so they can keep a job and keep working without having any shutdown on their side of things. Do you see anything outside of Utah or even in different places that see ESG score more where it comes into the religion side of things? They try to control religion and will hurt you if you are a religious person or believe a certain way?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're seeing that today. It may not necessarily be religion, but if you have the wrong idea about elections, vaccinations, whatever it is, right? We used to not be afraid of crazy ideas because we knew that we could get to the truth through the marketplace of ideas. But for some reason, we've decided that we need to cancel people who don't have the right ideas. Now, that could play very much into religion. In fact, all of our freedoms build off of the freedom to interact and to transact in the marketplace. If I'm not free to choose how I spend my money, all other freedoms go away because I suddenly can't support my church and I can't support, whoever it is, the political person that I want to support or whatever it is, right? The free market capitalism is the foundation of all freedoms that we enjoy, and it is being demonized today at an incredible rate. It's very scary. But the idea of the freedom of ideas being shut down is, I believe, the most dangerous trend that we're seeing here in America. And I tell people sometimes, my 8th great-grandmother died 330 years ago in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The oldest victim in the Salem witch trials. We've come full circle in this country where you're accused and you're guilty, right? We don't have the freedom of ideas. It's this culture that is very dangerous to all of us.
Can I just add, Marlo? I teach a class kind of in the year. I teach Intro to American Government, and I grew up in a home where we talked about politics at the dinner table. It was very normal to come home from school, and my dad would talk with us about what we learned at school, and then we would talk about whatever he was listening to on talk radio, quite frankly. At the time it was Michael Savage on his drive home, and it was really topical for me. I grew up talking politics and understanding issues, and
Yes.
And I'm not saying acting in anger, but if you're aware of the liberties we enjoy and you teach them, you're aware when they're being removed or they're threatened.
Yes.
But if we're not teaching it, and students are just taught, well, it's just convenient now. It's just all online now. Yeah, they have information. Who cares? Like, there are a lot of things that are concerning to me where I'm like, you should have a little red flag going off in your head right now that just isn't being taught. One more thing. The birth certificate bill I ran, so I have a 3.5-year-old. And when I went to the hospital, any woman in here who's given birth, you're done. Like, you had a baby, you're ready to get home with your new baby, and they're shoving paperwork at you. And I was so irritated the last day. I was like, what on earth is this 100-question survey? And they're like, the state requires you to do it. And I was like, well, we're going to fix that. And it was a 100-question survey. It needed to know my parents, my grandparents' education. They wanted to know whether I planned to nurse, whether my child was going to college. It was like my life story and my extended family 4 generations back. So when I went down to the Department of Health, I said, how on earth are you collecting all this information? They said, well, it's for your birth certificate. I was like, you need the name and date, and that's it. Like, what else do you need here? They're like, oh, no. This question, and we went through 100 questions and tied it all back to federal dollars. And what they do is if they put in that information, they get money. And then there's a national database, and what's crazy is they're like, isn't this phenomenal? They can take everyone's data and evaluate it. And I said, at no point did I sign to have my data given or used. So we redid the whole form. It's 20 questions. You have an option to opt out. But my point is this. They just happened to give that form to me. Like, and I mean, and how many moms had for years been like, oh yeah, here's all my data, no big deal. So we have to, there are things that we need to teach kids. Hey, this doesn't have to be this way. And I'm sorry to go on, but teaching this college class, there are some things that are really concerning to me. Basic American government understandings that we learn in 6th grade are not getting through the grapevine. And these people are 18, 19, 20. And they've got parents. It's not just the school system's job to be parents and educators, right? So there's a piece of this that, like, a little bit of ownership, we all need to step up. Obviously, you guys are very engaged because you're here tonight. But tell your friends, tell your neighbors, you got to October 28th to register to vote. Like, there has to be some momentum there.
Yes. Well, and I really appreciate what you said about just the engagement, right? To be able to have a discussion with somebody about political issues, right? Areas where you might disagree. That's a super important skill. In fact, if that would have happened in Austria in the 1890s and early 1900s, we could have avoided the Holocaust. Because Adolf Hitler, the thing that he hated, one of the things he hated most was debate and talking about issues. He didn't want to talk to anybody about issues because it was so uncomfortable for him. And as a result, he forced his agenda on everybody else. He had to have power to force his agenda. And that is one of the scariest things that we see in America today. People are afraid to engage. They're afraid to talk. They're afraid to have conversation. We have safe spaces now, right? It's insane and it's scary. So when we're engaged civilly, that's what our legislative process is. That's what the public square is. In order to get the best outcomes, we need people to engage. But you have to feel safe in engaging, and you have to feel comfortable with maybe your idea isn't the best, but you can adjust.
Can I name names? BlackRock, are they ESG, BlackRock?
They're the primary driver of ESG in this country, I would say.
Yes. Larry Fink is completely a mess. He's the one who's bringing a lot of this on. He's biting his little toy when it comes to ESG.
Just a short comment. The World Economic Forum created these 17 goals that ended up one of them being the financial goal you're talking about. And stopping them from destroying our capitalism and our society is the right thing to do and fighting back. But is there a group that you're working with other states and other countries to create an alternative view for the world so that we can have another 17 goals that have a capitalism as part of it? Is there an alternative for the world, or are we just fighting this huge machine that slowly is going to crush us?
That's a good question. I actually, back in 2006, was working on a socially responsible investment fund that sought to avoid companies that were destroying the family. So I thought, oh, you know what, I need to resurrect that and bring it back as sort of a conservative ESG, right? And so, but there are organizations, like I'm part of the State Financial Officers Foundation, SFOF, Congress. There are Democrats in Congress trying to cancel that. The congressman from Illinois told Jamie Dimon, that we're anti-free market capitalists, and so you shouldn't be donating money to the State Financial Officers Foundation and trying to cancel us, right? Our whole platform is free market capitalism. So, yes, there are, but I think, it's interesting. On the conservative side, we tend to be more individual-minded, right? But we are seeing people beginning to coalesce around the idea. They're starting to understand the dangers of ESG and coalescing around pushing back. And that's why Jamie Dimon doing what he did a few weeks ago was so important.
I think the principles that we need to get behind is just our U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
We don't need to come up with anything new. We just need to adhere to the Constitution.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, it's served us well, and it's created the most powerful nation on earth. It has created the most wealth in the world, our economic system. You've really got, the parents are our Constitution and our free market capitalist system. Those are the two systems that we've got to protect. So, any other questions before? Yeah.
So I assume for the regular financial scores, like when we apply for a loan, there's scores and there's for the states and everything. There's some criteria that are spelled out somewhere, right? And someone came up with those. On the ESG side, are there specific criteria that we know about that are written down someplace, and who came up with those? And
yeah. So the World Economic Forum and the UN, they have their sustainability. What are they? The Sustainable Development Goals, which are like ESG, World Economic Forum. But then you have the separate entities that are using them to score states and companies. Those are all different entities that are creating their own scoring system. So you'll hear arguments in the market saying, well, there's no consistency. We need consistency. And I say, no, we don't want consistency. Because as soon as you have consistency, then you have you will then embed this mechanism into our system overall, and it will become uniform. That's the most dangerous thing that can happen. So I don't want to see uniformity. It needs to go away. And right now it's being driven by a lot of different organizations.
So you said earlier that in order for this to affect individuals on their credit scores and things like that, we would need to have a digital currency. But I was thinking, after you said that we pretty much have that today for the most part, because everyone's got a debit card, everyone's got a credit. Very few people use cash anymore, and so we have a fiat currency to begin with. So it's basically made up money that we're dealing with. It's all just numbers in a bank somewhere.
Well, but the important part is that we have a private sector banking system. As soon as that goes away, and it's the federal government that's in charge, then you don't have any protection of the private sector, right.
We have these organizations that are giving us our FICO scores.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And all of that ties back into our banking system.
Yes, but right now the banks aren't implementing any kind of score like that on individuals. You can opt in with, I think, MasterCard if you want to have them track your carbon footprint, right? So feel free to do that if you want.
So I'm curious, what books, websites, things like that do you recommend people read and follow?
Yeah, so Vivek Ramaswamy wrote Woke Inc. That was a very important book for my understanding of what was going on. I highly recommend that book. I actually read it a couple of different times. There's also one called, what is it? No, that's not a book. But let's see, it's, oh goodness. Steve Sokup is the author. The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. That's another book, excellent book. The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. And then websites, so my website, marlooaks.com. I've written several articles. You can see some of the interviews I've done. And then, let's see. And then you can Google ESG, but I found like Epoch Times is very helpful. There's been some good articles there on ESG. Yeah, that's a good start, I guess. Yes, yeah, that'll be very, very good. What are you saying back there? Okay. Time to stop. So can we turn off the camera? And vote for Candace. I'm also on the ballot this year. I'm on the ballot this for the first time, so you can also vote for me. Thank you. Oh yeah, if you would like a sign, we have signs in the back of our car. We have very few here in Salt Lake. It's embarrassing. So feel free to take a sign. Or three, yeah. Thank you for coming.